The afternoon sun sliced through the tall windows of the bistro, casting long, bright lines across the checkered floor. It was the kind of place where the coffee cups were never chipped and the napkins were made of thick cloth, not paper. For most of the people sitting at the small round tables, this was just a pleasant spot to spend a Tuesday. But for Lily, it was a battlefield. She moved between the tables with a tray balanced carefully on one hand, her eyes scanning the room for empty glasses or customers looking confused. Lily was 23, though she felt much older on days like this. Her uniform was a crisp black shirt and dark trousers, the kind of outfit that hid stains well but didn't do much for comfort. Her shoes were black leather, sensible and flat, designed for walking miles on hard floors, not for looking pretty. She had been working at the Brass Spoon for 6 months, and in that time, she had learned that the most important skill a server could have was the ability to become invisible. People wanted their food hot and their water cold, but they didn't want to see the person struggling to make that happen. She stopped at table 4, where a man in a gray suit was typing furiously on a laptop. "More water, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice low. He didn't look up. He just gave a small, annoyed wave of his hand, like he was shooing away a fly. Lily didn't take it personally. She knew the rhythm of the lunch rush. It wasn't about her, it was about them. She filled the glass silently and moved on. At the next table, a young woman was laughing loudly into her phone. Lily waited patiently for a break in the conversation, a polite smile fixed on her face. It was a mask she wore for hours every day. Underneath the smile, her feet throbbed. She had been on her feet since 6 o'clock that morning, prepping lemons and polishing cutlery. There was a dull ache in her lower back that never really went away anymore. It was just part of the job description. She cleared the empty plates from the table, stacking them with a practiced clatter that was soft enough not to disturb the peace but loud enough to show she was efficient. As she walked toward the kitchen, the smell of roasted garlic and fresh bread washed over her. It smelled delicious, but her stomach gave a small, painful twist. She hadn't had time to eat anything herself today except a piece of toast grabbed in the dark before dawn. The smells of luxury were nice, but they didn't pay the rent. In the kitchen, the heat was intense. Chefs were shouting orders, pans were sizzling, and steam rose in thick clouds. Lily slid the plates into the soapy water basin and grabbed a fresh pot of coffee. The head chef, a big man with a red face who was usually shouting, gave her a quick nod. "Table 7 is impatient," he warned her. Lily nodded back. "I got it." She pushed through the swinging door that led back to the dining room, taking a deep breath of the cooler air. She smoothed her shirt and put the mask back on. Table 7 was in the corner, a spot usually reserved for VIPs or people who wanted privacy. Sitting there was a man who looked like he owned the building. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Lily's car, if she had a car. He had a watch that glinted under the lights and a haircut that looked precise and expensive. His name was Julian Vance, though Lily didn't know that yet. To her, he was just the suit. He was sitting alone, looking at his phone with a look of intense boredom. There was no food in front of him, just a glass of sparkling water. Lily approached the table. She noticed that his hands were resting on the white tablecloth. They were clean, manicured hands. She couldn't help but stare at them for a split second. They were hands that had never scrubbed a floor or carried a heavy tray. They were hands that had spent their life pushing pens or tapping on keyboards. "Good afternoon," she said. "Can I get you started with something to eat, or would you like to see the menu?" Julian looked up. His eyes were sharp, scanning her face. For a moment, Lily felt uncomfortable, like she was being x-rayed. He didn't look at her chest or her legs like some of the younger customers did, he looked at her hands. "I'm waiting for someone," he said. His voice was smooth, deep, and commanding. "But I'll take a coffee. Black. And the menu." "Right away, sir." Lily turned to leave, but as she did, her fingers brushed against the edge of the table. It wasn't a clumsy bump, it was a light, unconscious touch. She trailed her fingertips along the smooth wood as she walked away. It was a habit she had, a way of grounding herself when she was tired. "Wait," the man said. Lily stopped and turned back around. "Yes, sir." He was staring at her hand. "You play, don't you?" Lily blinked, confused. "I'm sorry." "The piano," Julian said, pointing a finger toward the far end of the room. Lily followed his gaze. In the center of the bistro, raised up on a small wooden platform, stood a baby grand piano. It was glossy and black, reflecting the room like a mirror. During the evenings, a man in a tuxedo would sit there and play jazz standards. During the day, it sat silent, a piece of furniture that everyone ignored. Lily looked at it, and for a second, her guard slipped. Her eyes softened. She quickly looked back at the customer, forcing the polite, blank expression back onto her face. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she said. "I'll get your coffee." She hurried away before he could say anything else. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual. She didn't like it when customers noticed her. She preferred being a background character, a blur in a black shirt. Being noticed meant questions, and questions meant explaining things she didn't want to talk about. She reached the counter where the coffee machine was hissing and steaming. Her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed a ceramic cup. The barista, a guy named Ben who was always chewing gum, looked at her. "You okay, Lily? You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," she said, pouring the dark liquid. "Just a weird customer at table 7. The rich guy Ben asked. "He comes in sometimes. Big shot tech guy. Throws money around like it's confetti. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Lily said. She picked up the cup and the menu. She needed to focus. Her mind drifted for a moment, against her will, to the piano. She remembered being 6 years old, sitting on a bench that was too high for her feet to touch the floor. She remembered the smell of lemon polish on the wood and the heavy feel of the keys. She remembered a deep, booming laugh that made her feel safe. She shook her head, physically shaking the memory away. That was a different life. That was before the bills piled up, before the arguments started, before the house got quiet. Before she had to trade her sheet music for a server's apron. Lily walked back across the restaurant. She kept her eyes strictly on the table, not on the piano in the middle of the room. She felt a strange tension in her shoulders, a tightness that had nothing to do with carrying trays. She reached table 7 and set the coffee down gently. The steam rose up between them. Julian Vance was watching her closely. He hadn't touched his phone since she left. He was looking at her fingers again, specifically the way they held the handle of the coffee pot. "You have a musician's hands," he said. It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement of fact. Lily pulled her hand back quickly and hid it behind her back. "I'm just a waitress, sir. Here is the menu." She tried to step away, but the intensity of his gaze held her in place. It wasn't aggressive, but it was powerful. He was a man who was used to getting answers. "Your fingers," he continued, ignoring her attempt to deflect. They are long. Thin. And you touched the table just now. You traced a pattern. A scale. I saw it. Lily felt a flush rising up her neck. She was embarrassed that he had seen her tick, and annoyed that he wouldn't drop it. She just wanted to do her job and go home. I think you're imagining things, sir, she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. Maybe, Julian said, leaning back in his chair. A small smile played on his lips. It wasn't a mocking smile, it looked like he was amused by a puzzle he was trying to solve. Or maybe you're hiding something. I'm good at spotting people who are hiding things. It's my business. Well, my business right now is serving your coffee, Lily said. Is there anything else? Julian picked up the cup and took a slow sip. He placed it back down on the saucer with a soft clink. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden quiet around them. The lunch rush was slowing down, and the nearby tables were empty. Tell you what, he said. He gestured toward the empty platform and the silent piano. Go sit down. Play one song, just one. Lily stared at him. Sir, I can't do that. It's against the rules. I'm working. I'll talk to the manager, he said dismissively. I know the owner. He won't mind. I can't, she repeated. Her voice was tight. Why? Julian asked. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Are you afraid you're not good enough, or are you afraid that you are? Lily felt the words like a slap. She looked around the room. A few people were glancing over, curious about the conversation. She felt trapped. The air in the bistro felt suddenly thick and hard to breathe. The piano sat there in the center of the floor, looking innocent and terrifying all at once. It represented everything she had lost and everything she refused to let herself want again. I have other tables, she lied. I have to go. She turned and walked away, faster than before. She didn't look back at the rich man in the suit. She walked straight to the kitchen, pushing through the doors, letting the noise and the heat of the stove swallow her up. She leaned against a stainless steel counter, closing her eyes, taking deep breaths. She could feel her heart thumping against her ribs. For a moment, just a moment, she had wanted to say yes. And that scared her more than anything. Lily leaned against the cold metal counter in the kitchen, trying to slow her racing heart. The noise of the lunch rush clanged around her, pots banging, the fryer sizzling, the sharp shout of an order being called out. Usually, these sounds comforted her. They were the sounds of work, of money being earned, of survival. But today, they felt like a wall that was closing in. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, staring blindly at a large silver pot of soup. Table 7 is asking for you again, Ben said, popping his head through the service window. He looked concerned, his gum forgotten for once. You okay, Lil? I'm fine, Lily said, standing up straight and smoothing her apron. It was a lie, of course. She wasn't fine. She felt rattled, like a cup that had been set down too hard on a saucer. What does he want? He didn't say. Just asked for you by your uniform color, said the girl in the black shirt. Lily took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of roasted tomatoes and basil. She had to go back out there. She couldn't hide in the kitchen forever. Rent was due in 3 days, and she couldn't afford to lose this job or the tips. She pushed through the swinging doors, putting her mask back on. The polite, tired, invisible waitress. When she reached table 7, Julian Vance hadn't moved. He was still sitting alone, looking remarkably calm. He had a small notebook open on the table now, and he was scribbling something with a silver pen. He didn't look up until Lily was standing right over him. "Is everything all right with the coffee, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice flat. He capped the pen and set it down. "The coffee is excellent, but I'm not interested in the coffee anymore." Lily felt a prickle of irritation. She had tables to clear. She had a woman at table 3 who was complaining about her soup being too cold. She didn't have time for mind games. "Sir, if there isn't anything else, I really need to attend to my other guests." "I made a few calls while you were gone," Julian said, ignoring her attempt to leave. "I spoke to the manager. He says you've been working here for 6 months. He says you're reliable. He says you never take a day off." Lily shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I like to work." "Do you?" Julian looked up at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Or do you just like to stay busy?" "What difference does it make to you?" The words slipped out before Lily could stop them. It was insubordination. She could get fired for talking back to a customer like that. She braced herself for him to call the manager, to demand she be fired. Instead, Julian smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It makes a difference because I hate wasted talent. It's a pet peeve of mine. I see it all the time in my business. People with brilliant minds doing menial tasks because they're afraid to fail at something bigger." "I am not afraid," Lily snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am a waitress. That is my job. It is an honest job." "It is," he agreed. "But it's not who you are." He gestured toward the grand piano again. The restaurant had emptied out a bit as the lunch crowd thinned. The instrument sat there in the sliver of sunlight coming through the window, dust motes dancing around it. It looked lonely. "I bet you haven't touched a keyboard in years," Julian said softly. The accusation hung in the air between them. "I bet you walk past that thing every single day and you pretend you don't see it. You pretend it's just a piece of furniture." Lily looked at the piano. Her throat felt tight. She remembered the last time she had played. It was in a drafty community hall, the day before the funeral. She had played until her fingers bled, trying to pour all her anger and sadness into the keys, trying to exhaust herself so she wouldn't have to cry. When she stood up, her hands were shaking, and she swore she would never play again. Music was for people who had hope, and she had used up all of hers. "Why are you doing this?" Lily asked, looking back at the man. She realized her eyes were stinging, and she blinked rapidly to clear them. "Why do you care? You don't know me." "You're right, I don't," Julian said. He leaned back, folding his arms. "But I'm a businessman, Lily. I assess risk and reward. And I'm telling you, looking at you, the risk is low, but the reward is high." "Reward for who?" "For both of us." He picked up the silver pen again, tapping it against the table. "Let us make a deal. A wager." "I'm not a betting woman," she said coldly. "Humor me. It's a simple bet. You walk over to that piano, you sit down. You play one song. Anything you like. If you play, and it's terrible, if you're rusty, if you have no talent, if you're just a waitress who likes to tap on tables, then I will leave. I will finish my coffee, pay my bill, and never bother you again. I will leave $1,000 tip, just for wasting your time." Lily's eyes widened. $1,000. That was the rent. That was the electric bill. That was a month of groceries. And if I don't play, she asked. Then I stay here and drink coffee until you close, he said. And I'll keep asking. Lily let out a short, frustrated breath. That's blackmail. It's incentive, Julian corrected. But I haven't told you the best part. If you play, and it's good, if you play like I think you can play, I will pay your rent for a year. Lily stared at him. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around the restaurant to see if anyone else was hearing this insanity. The few remaining customers were eating, oblivious to the conversation that was turning Lily's world upside down. A year, she whispered. You can't just say that. That's impossible. For me, it's a rounding error, Julian said casually. But for you, I saw your shoes, Lily. I saw the way you looked at the dessert menu yesterday like it was a foreign language. You're tired. You're drowning. And I'm throwing you a rope. It's charity, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. It's a dare, he corrected. You don't want charity, fine. Earn it. Show me you're too good to be a waitress. Show me you have something inside you that the world needs to hear. He stood up then. He wasn't a tall man, but he had a presence that made him feel huge. He walked past her, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air, and stopped a few feet away from the piano. He turned to look at her. Come on, he said. His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It was quiet. Encouraging. Don't do it for the money. Do it because you miss it. I saw your face when I mentioned your hands. You miss it? Lily stood frozen by the table. The argument in her head was screaming at her to run. To grab her coat and walk out the door and never come back. This man was turning her life inside out. He was dragging up memories she had buried under layers of exhaustion and routine. But then she looked at the piano. It was a beautiful instrument. A Steinway. She could see the reflection of the room in the black lacquer. She thought about the dusty sheet music in the box under her bed at home. She thought about the silence in her apartment, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. The money. It was the money, she told herself. She had to be practical. 1 year of rent meant she could go back to school. It meant she could fix her teeth. It meant she could breathe. It was a crazy offer, a too good to be true offer, but what did she have to lose? Her dignity. She felt like she had lost that years ago, one tip at a time. She took a step. Just one small step. Her sensible shoe made a soft squeak on the tile floor. Julian didn't move. He just watched her, a faint smile on his face. Lily took another step. She felt like she was walking underwater. The restaurant seemed to fade away, the sounds becoming muffled. All she could see was the curve of the piano lid. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break them. What if I fail? She asked, her voice barely a whisper across the distance between them. Then you fail, Julian said with a shrug. And you go back to clearing tables. But at least you'll know. Lily looked at her hands. They were shaking. She balled them into fists to stop the trembling. She was terrified. Not of the piano, but of what would happen when she let the music out. She had locked the music away with her grief, and she wasn't sure she could put it back in the box. But the rent. The year of freedom. She took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of coffee and floor wax. She straightened her spine. She wasn't just a tired waitress anymore. She was a girl who used to make music that made people cry. She was a girl who used to believe she had something to offer. Lily walked toward the platform. Every step felt heavy, like she was walking through deep mud. As she got closer, the piano seemed to get bigger. It loomed over her, imposing and magnificent. She stepped up onto the small wooden platform. It felt like climbing onto a stage. She turned and looked at Julian. He was leaning against a chair, watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. The other patrons were starting to notice now. The clatter of silverware slowed down. People were turning in their seats to watch the girl in the apron approach the instrument that was usually reserved for the weekend jazz trio. Lily sat down on the bench. It was firm and leather-covered. She smelled the faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. It was a smell that hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Memories crashed over her, her father's hands guiding hers, the sound of rain against the window. She quickly pushed that thought away, the feeling of vibration humming up through the floorboards. She placed her hands on her knees. She couldn't do it. Her hands were frozen. She looked at the black and white keys. They were perfect. They were expecting her. Just one song, Julian's voice drifted over from the table. Just for yourself. Lily closed her eyes. She let out a long, shaky breath. She didn't think about the money. She didn't think about the customers watching. She thought about the silence in her apartment. She thought about the noise in her head. She thought about the way her fingers had traced the table just a few minutes ago, desperate for a connection they couldn't find. She lifted her hands. They hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She took one more breath, held it for a second, and then let it out as she brought her fingers down. The moment her fingertips made contact with the cool ivory, a jolt shot through Lily's arm, sharp and electric. It wasn't just a touch, it was a connection, like plugging a frayed wire into a live socket. She instinctively pulled her hands back, hovering them just inches above the keys as if the surface had burned her. The grand piano sat silent and expectant, a sleeping beast waiting to be woken. The silence in the room was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was the kind that presses against your eardrums, filled with the held breath of 30 strangers. Lily looked out at the room. The diners at the nearby tables had stopped eating. Forks were suspended halfway to mouths. A waiter was frozen near the kitchen, balancing a tray high in the air. They were all looking at her. She could feel their gaze like a physical weight, pinning her to the bench. Usually, she could ignore people. She could make herself invisible by blending into the background, becoming part of the furniture. But here, on this raised platform, she was the center of the universe. She felt exposed, like a specimen under a microscope. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. I can't do this, she thought. The panic rose in her chest, cold and suffocating. I'm a waitress. I carry plates. I don't play Beethoven on a Tuesday afternoon in a restaurant where I can barely afford the appetizers. She looked back toward table 7. Julian was still there, watching her. He hadn't moved. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't looking arrogant or amused. His face was still, his eyes focused entirely on her. He wasn't looking at the girl in the apron, he was looking at the musician. He looked calm, as if he knew exactly what was going to happen next. That calmness only made Lily more nervous. She felt like she was standing on a high ledge, looking down, and he was the one telling her to jump. She turned her eyes back to the keys. They were blurring slightly as tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She blinked them away furiously. She didn't want to cry here. Not in front of these people. Not in front of him. Her hands were trembling. The rough, red skin on her fingertips from scrubbing dishes felt foreign against the smooth, polished keys. These were the hands of a laborer, not an artist. They were hands that were chipped and worn. She remembered when her hands were soft, before the bills, before the struggle. Back when the only thing she had to worry about was hitting the right note. "Why did you come up here?" a voice whispered in her head. It was her own voice, but it sounded harsh. "You're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to play one wrong note and they're going to laugh. They're going to go back to their meals and whisper about the delusional waitress." She started to slide off the bench. It was over. The fear was winning. She would go back to the kitchen, tell Ben she was sick, and go home to her empty, silent apartment. She would accept that her life was what it was, and dreams were just for children. She moved her foot to the floor, her shoe making a scuffing sound against the wood. "Just one chord," Julian's voice cut through the air, soft but clear. Lily froze. She looked up. He hadn't shouted, but in the quiet room, it carried. "Play one note," he said again. "Not for me. For you." Lily stared at him. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him to shut up, to leave her alone, to let her disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. She didn't ask for this. She didn't ask for him to come into her restaurant and dig up things she had buried years ago. But underneath the anger, there was something else. A tiny, flickering spark. It was buried deep under layers of exhaustion and cynicism, but it was there. It was the part of her that used to close her eyes and let the music take her away to a place where there was no pain, no money problems, and no loneliness. It was the part of her that still listened to the classical radio station on the bus ride home, even though it made her sad. She looked down at her hands again. They were still shaking, but not as violently as before. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of lemon polish and the faint smell of coffee drifting from the tables. Just one note, she told herself. What harm can one note do? If she played one note and it sounded terrible, she could walk away. She could say, "See, I told you I was rusty." She could go back to her tables and her life, and the money wouldn't matter because she would know she tried. Slowly, painfully slowly, Lily lifted her hands. She didn't place them on the keys to start a song. She just rested them there, her fingers curved slightly. The black and white pattern stretched out before her like a city she used to live in, but hadn't visited in a long time. She flexed her fingers. They felt stiff. The joints ached with the memory of repetitive motion, the kind of motion used to carry heavy trays, not the delicate motion required to coax melody from strings. She felt a sudden wave of shame for letting them get this way. She had let her gift rust, let it gather dust just like the piano sitting in the corner of her living room at home. One note. She chose a key in the middle of the keyboard. AC. It was safe. Simple. Lily pressed down. The sound that rang out was clear and pure, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a knife. It resonated through the bench, through the floor, and into the solace of her shoes. It was a single, perfect tone. It hung in the air for a second, vibrating, before fading into silence. Lily didn't pull her hand away. She held it there, feeling the vibration of the string. It was a strange sensation, almost like holding a heartbeat. That one note felt louder than anything she had heard in years. It was louder than the traffic outside, louder than the shouting in the kitchen, louder than the constant nagging worry in her mind. She looked around the room again. No one was laughing. No one was whispering. A woman near the window had actually put her phone down. They were waiting. The silence had shifted from awkward to expectant. Lily closed her eyes. She blocked out the view of the expensive tables, the chandeliers, the man in the suit. She blocked out the memory of who she was now, the tired, broke waitress. She tried to reach back to a time when music was her only language. She thought about the song her father used to play. It wasn't a classical piece. It was an old folk song, simple and melancholic. He would play it in the evenings when the sun went down. The melody was slow, with a bass line that walked up and down like footsteps. Her left hand moved on its own, finding the bass note. A low G. Then an A. Then a B. The sound was deep and rich, filling the empty spaces of the room. It wasn't just a noise, it was a texture. It felt like velvet. Lily's breathing slowed down. The trembling in her hands stopped. The stiffness in her fingers began to loosen as her muscle memory woke up. It was like greeting an old friend you haven't seen in a decade. You don't know where to start, but once you start talking, the words just pour out. She added the harmony with her right hand. A simple chord. It wasn't the complex jazz the weekend band played. It wasn't the showy pop songs that came on the radio. It was slow. It was sad. But it was beautiful. She wasn't thinking about the money anymore. She wasn't thinking about Julian Vance or the rent. She was only thinking about the next note. The pressure of her finger, the strike of the hammer, the vibration of the string. It was the only thing that mattered in the world. She played a melody line. High notes that sang like a bird, lonely in a gray sky. The notes flowed into each other, connected by the invisible thread of her emotion. She made a mistake, a slight fumble on a transition, but she didn't stop. She didn't apologize. She just kept playing. In music, unlike life, you could keep moving forward even if you stumbled. You could turn a mistake into part of the song. The air around the piano seemed to change. It felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. The music was pulling people in. Lily could feel it without opening her eyes. The energy of the room was no longer pushing against her, it was drawing toward her. They were listening. Really listening. She played the chorus of the folk song. It swelled, getting louder for a moment, before dipping back down into a whisper. It sounded like a conversation, a question and an answer. It was the sound of longing. It was the sound of missing someone you can never get back. A tear escaped from under her closed eyelid and rolled down her cheek, dripping onto her black shirt. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. The music was washing her clean from the inside out. It was scraping away the rust and the grime of the last few years. It hurt, but it was a good hurt, like touching a bruise to see if it was healed. She was still afraid. She was terrified that if she opened her eyes, the spell would break. But for the first time in a long time, the fear wasn't in control. The music was. Her hands, usually so clumsy and heavy with dishes, were weightless. They danced over the keys with a grace she thought she had lost forever. The notes hung in the air, echoing off the high ceiling. The restaurant was gone. The tables were gone. There was only the sound, and the girl making it, and the memories swirling around her like leaves in the wind. She was playing for her father. She was playing for the girl she used to be. And as the melody grew, weaving a spell over the silent room, she realized she wasn't just playing a song. She was finally telling the truth. The melody was no longer just a sound, it was a living thing breathing in the room. As Lily's fingers moved from the gentle, weeping folk song into something deeper, the air around the piano seemed to thicken. The notes were no longer separate points of sound. They were blending together, washing over the diners like a slow, warm wave. The restaurant, usually filled with the clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation, had fallen into a state of absolute stillness. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone in the room is holding their breath at the same time. Lily's eyes remained closed. She was too afraid to open them. If she looked, she knew she would see the crumbs on the tables, the scuff marks on the floor, the reality of her messy, hard life. With her eyes shut, she could be anywhere. She could be back in the old living room on the worn carpet. She could be sitting on the bench next to the only person who ever truly knew her. She could feel the vibrations of the piano traveling up through the wooden bench and into her bones. It felt like coming home after walking for miles in the cold. Her fingers, which had been stiff and hesitant just moments ago, were beginning to remember. They knew the way down the keys. They found the cracks between the black and white notes without her having to look. The muscle memory that she thought had died years ago was actually just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. The song shifted. The simple, sad melody began to grow. It wasn't a folk song anymore. It was morphing into something classical, something grand. Lily's mind emptied of everything except the music. She didn't think about the rent check sitting on her kitchen counter. She didn't think about the blisters on her heels or the ache in her back. She didn't think about the apron tied around her waist. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't a waitress. She was a musician. She let her left hand drop lower, playing a heavy, rolling bass line that shook the floorboards. The sound was rich and dark, like velvet. Her right hand climbed up the scale, playing fast, intricate runs that sparkled like light hitting water. She wasn't reading music, there was no sheet music in front of her. She was playing from a place deep inside her chest, a place she kept locked up during the day. She was pouring all her frustration into the keys. Every time she had smiled politely at a rude customer, every time she had swallowed her pride, every time she had walked home in the cold because the bus fare was too expensive, it was all coming out. The music was angry in some parts, sharp and biting. Then it would turn soft and mournful, weeping for the lost time, for the years she spent hiding her talent. The people at the tables were spellbound. A businessman near the window had put his hand over his mouth, his eyes wide. The woman who had been laughing on the phone earlier was now staring at the piano, her phone forgotten on the table, tears streaming silently down her face. They weren't just hearing a song, they were feeling a story. It was a story they recognized, the story of being human, of being tired, of wishing for something more. Even Ben, the gum-chewing barista, had come out of the kitchen. He was standing by the service door, leaning against the frame, his mouth slightly open. He had known Lily for 6 months. He had seen her tired, seen her grumpy, seen her complaining about the dishwasher. But he had never seen this. The girl sitting at the piano looked like a stranger. She looked fierce. Her back was straight, her posture perfect. Her hands moved with a speed and power that seemed impossible for someone who spent her days carrying trays. Lily felt the energy of the room pulling at her, but she didn't let it distract her. Instead, she used it. She played louder. The music swelled, filling the high ceilings of the bistro. The grand piano, which usually sat silent and ignored, was singing. It roared with a voice that demanded to be heard. She transitioned into a movement that was incredibly difficult. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion. Her breath came in short gasps, not from exhaustion, but from the intensity of the emotion. It felt like she was running a race she had been training for her whole life. She was sweating now, a small bead of trickling down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. She thought about the offer Julian had made. 1 year of rent. It seemed so small now. The music was worth more than money. The feeling of her soul waking up was worth more than a paycheck. But she also knew she couldn't go back. She couldn't unhear this sound. She couldn't unfeel this power. Once the music stopped, she would have to face the world again, but she knew she wouldn't be the same person. The song reached its peak. It was a chaotic, beautiful storm of sound. The bass notes thundered like a heartbeat, the treble notes cried out like a bird in flight. It was the sound of a heart breaking and healing all at the same time. Lily's fingers ached, but she pushed through the pain. She wanted to give it everything. She wanted to leave every ounce of herself on this piano bench. She played a series of chords that were dissonant and harsh, creating tension that made everyone in the room lean forward, their muscles tight. Then, she resolved it. She brought her hands back to the middle of the keyboard and played a simple, pure melody. It was like the sun coming out after a storm. The relief in the room was palpable. Lily slowed the tempo down. The music became gentle again. It was a whisper now, a secret shared between her and the piano. She was no longer performing for the crowd. She was saying goodbye. She was saying goodbye to the girl who gave up, to the girl who thought she wasn't good enough. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, playing delicate, high notes that faded into the air like smoke. She pressed the sustain pedal, letting the notes hang and blend together. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort. Finally, her hands found the last chord. It wasn't a showy ending. It was a resolution. It felt like closing a book that had been left open for too long. She struck the keys with firmness, holding the chord down, letting the vibration hum through her arms and into the floor. She sat there, her hands frozen on the keys, listening as the sound began to decay. The ringing echoed off the walls, slowly getting softer and softer, until it was just a memory in the air. Lily kept her eyes closed. She was afraid to move. She felt like she was floating in a dark, quiet ocean. She didn't know how long she sat there. It could have been seconds, or it could have been minutes. She was aware of a ringing in her ears, the aftermath of such loud and beautiful noise. She slowly pulled her hands away from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her fingers were throbbing slightly, a dull, satisfying ache. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Before, the silence was heavy with judgment and curiosity. Now, the silence was heavy with awe. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire restaurant was made of glass, and any sudden noise might shatter it. Lily slowly opened her eyes. The bright light of the afternoon made her squint. Her vision adjusted, bringing the room back into focus. She saw the polished wood of the piano, the music stand that was empty. She looked down at her lap, at the black fabric of her apron, at her hands resting there. They looked the same as they always had, but to her, they looked different. They looked capable. She took a deep, shaky breath and let it out. She realized she was crying. Tears were streaming down her face, dripping onto her black shirt. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed. She wasn't supposed to cry. She was supposed to be strong. But the music had torn the walls down. She looked up, terrified of what she would see. She expected people to be looking at their phones again, laughing at her, or checking their watches. She expected the moment to be over. But when she looked out at the room, nobody was looking at their phones. Every single person was looking at her. Some were standing. The woman near the window was openly crying, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. The businessman had taken off his glasses and was holding them in his hand, looking stunned. Ben was still by the door, staring at her with his mouth open. Lily felt a flush rise to her cheeks. The spell was broken. She wasn't in a dream anymore. She was a waitress in a bistro, sitting at a piano she wasn't supposed to touch. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and incredibly small. She gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles turning white. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak and wobbly. She felt dizzy. She turned to step down from the platform, ready to run back to the safety of the kitchen, ready to grab her things and disappear forever. She couldn't face Julian. She couldn't face the pity or the praise. She just wanted to hide. But as she turned, her eyes locked with his. Julian hadn't moved. He was still sitting at his table, but his posture had changed completely. He wasn't leaning back with a smirk. He was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together in front of his mouth. His eyes were intense, burning with a mixture of shock and respect. He didn't look like a man watching a waitress anymore. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps, a miracle. He held her gaze, and in that look, Lily knew that her life had just changed forever. There was no going back to the shadows. The music had found her, and now, everyone else had found her too.